Welcome to our webinar on building individual redemptive relationships. I'm Marshall Shannon, a ministry design coach with Ministry Design Training. Let me put in front of you just 4 basic steps that are commonly accepted as the 4 things that any church in the United States needs to regularly perform in order to succeed at fulfilling the Great Commission. You've got to reach people where they are, the unchurched and the dechurched. You've got to keep them long enough so that you can equip them and educate them and prepare them to engage with their lost friends, the unchurched and dechurched, so that they can in turn reach them, keep them, equip them, so that they can go out and make disciples. And so you have a cycle where people are not just one to your church to be spectators, but they're there to participate and be able to make disciples that will make more disciples, and you continue to build your ministry generation to generation, decade to decade, century to century. How you go about doing that can change and alter as the culture shifts and as time moves on. And so as we look at this today on building redemptive relationships, we want to deal with the reach and the keep of the 4 phases of church life if you're going to fulfill the Great Commission. So as we go through this, let me ask you, what are you trying to build? I wrote a blog post some time ago on building a castle or a crusade. And let me explain what I'm saying or asking. When a church builds a castle, they are primarily internally focused and postured. And so let me ask you, what is your focus? There are primarily 3 options that you have to balance in any church. If you get these out of balance, as God has a plan for your ministry, you're probably going to plateau or start to decline. The first one is everyone ought to have an upward focus where they worship God. We do this very well. We have worship services, Bible studies. We focus on the Lord. We pray together. We sing together. We listen to the teaching and preaching and respond together. We fellowship and encourage one another, and we do very well, I think, at focusing on an upward direction toward God. I'm not saying that there isn't need for improvement. I'm saying that one we're heavily balanced toward our upward focus. The second one is an inward focus. By inward focus, I mean that we're focused on the congregation and the regular attenders in our church. We're focused on our church congregation. The third option is outward. This is where we focus on the unchurched and the dechurched. It's turning the eyes outward. And the idea of building a castle is that churches are primarily focused on the first 2. They are upward and inward focused. Now, to help you with this, let me give you some statistics to back up what I am saying. Tom Rainer has done research, and in the research he says that 95% of church programs in the United States are designed to benefit the membership. Secondly, other research has said that 97 cents of every dollar in church budgets in the United States, they are designated to benefit the members. Number 3, research that was done in 2000 and again in 2005 states that only 3% of the churches in the United States are growing by conversion rate, meaning they're growing because the unchurched are coming to faith in Christ. Then the other 12%, because the statistics shown by the Pew Foundation from 1985 to 2005, they followed 200,000 churches in the United States, their weekly attendance, and at the end of the 20-year research said that that only 85% of the only 15% of the churches were growing. 85% were either plateaued or in decline. Well, if 3% of the churches that are growing by conversion rate, there's 12% of the churches that are growing by transfer rate, meaning people coming out of town who are believers and they come and decide to join and be a part of your church family. Or they're coming from churches across the street or across town and coming to your church for some reason, and they know the Lord and they've been saved for a period of time. They're believers. And so as we look at the statistics, what we begin to see as we begin to piece all of this together, that we have a problem. And we need to honestly and openly address it. And as the leaders, we need to begin taking responsibility to get our church balanced in our focus. And it's obvious that our focus is upward and inward, and very little of our focus is outward. And how do you determine that? Well, you're going to look at your money, your ministers, and your ministry to determine even your facilities. If everything is inward focused and you're out of balance with your effort to reach lost people, and you look at how you use your money and your ministries and your ministers and what their operations are, what their job descriptions are, and how you use your money and how you're budgeting, and it honestly tells you that the majority, if not the vast majority, of your focus is inward, that you're really going to have to take some steps to lead your church into a different balance that will enable you to effectively fulfill the Great Commission. Well, let me give you some common approaches to personal evangelism. Well, let me ask you this. What methods are you currently using to win people to Christ? How are you evangelizing your community? This one video is meant to partner with our other video on corporate connectivity. In other words, corporate evangelistic effort, corporate methodology, where your church is looking how all the congregation together is going to fulfill the Great Commission. In this video, we're talking about individual participation in evangelizing the community. So common approaches to personal evangelism, not corporate evangelism, but personal evangelism. And there are three common ways, generally speaking, there are three common ways that have been used for some decades and to reach people with the gospel. So how successful is your church at using the primary methods you have for personal evangelism? Is it 10%, 20%, 30%? 60% that you're retaining for some time? And so here are three common approaches that are used in our countries today, in our churches today in our country, to win people to Christ. The first one I've called the messenger approach. In the messenger approach, which is the teacher and student approach, in this evangelistic approach, we give the gospel to an unchurched person and then wait for their response. Usually this method is a one-way street. We give them the facts and hope that they will respond favorably to the gospel. Examples of this method may be preaching on the radio, television, the internet, a podcast. It can be done person to person or in a Bible study. If the listener didn't respond correctly, then we're likely going to go back and analyze our delivery, how we talk to them, and we want to perfect it. We figure this: if they didn't respond correctly or favorably to the message we gave them, it's because we didn't communicate it correctly. The basic thought is, to be a better soul winner, we've got to be a better messenger, a better communicator. It is assumed that if we get the message right, people will come to Christ. Some would call this simply information dump, that it's a one-way approach to it. It's a monologue. You're talking to them on the street corner, on the bus, on the plane, in your car, across the supper table, and you're giving them the gospel. and you're giving them information. There's no interaction between them. The second common approach to a personal evangelism is what I call the manipulator approach. And the manipulator approach is what some have called the salesman-customer approach. And this is where we sell the potential customer the gospel using facts and emotional appeal. So we take the messenger and now we've made it a dialogue, and we're going to talk with them, but we're going to use an approach where we're going to lead them through a series of well-crafted questions that guide them to the right response. It can blend both their logic and their emotions to gain the desired response. This approach is usually a two-way street that involves a question and then an answer. And as you lead them through the process, you're going to sell them through logic and emotion on the fact that they're in desperate need of Christ and why they should come to Christ and trust Him as their personal Savior. Well, here's the warning I have for you. It's a sales technique that is used in the business world, in the retail world. And if the person you're talking to recognizes the technique, it may have an adverse or an opposite result or response than what you're wanting, because they know that you're manipulating them through your question and answer process. Even though it's a dialogue, and even though you're giving them a chance just to respond in their own thinking, you're not, you haven't grabbed them by the arm and twisted it behind their back and forced them to comply to answering in the affirmative. It is viewed as a manipulative sales technique where you're selling them on it. You would use the same technique for selling vacuum cleaners door to door, or Tupperware, or that is used in a shoe store. And it is commonly not viewed very well by the unchurched if they know what you are doing. The third one I have called the meaningful approach. In this one, it's based on a relationship. And this method calls for us to invest our lives in people and take an interest in them. It's the friend to friend. It's life on life. By investing, I mean we give our lives to that unchurched person, and we develop a relationship with them by care and concern for them and taking an interest in the things that are important to them. We're not concerned about selling them. We're not concerned about the idea of giving them the information and keep at it until they comply and conform. This is where we show genuine Christ-like concern, and we adopt as our own God's redemptive passion for their soul, for their person, for their eternal soul. It is life-on-life evangelism. It is where we are going to take an interest in them and focus perhaps on what is important to them, and we want to help them come to Christ. And as we get to this, we're going to invite them to follow Christ wherever they are. Years ago, I think 2006, Tom Rainer had his research group interview 500 unchurched people to find out their posture toward Christ and toward Christianity. In the book, The Unchurched Next Door, Tom communicates in written page the 5 different categories that they broke down the unchurched in their posture, their receptiveness toward Christ. U1 was a person simply looking for an invitation from a believer to come to Christ. U2 was more reserved, resisting. 3 and 4 and 5, and you went from 1 being totally accepted, waiting for an invitation to accept Christ, to U5, unchurched 5, where they were antagonistic, and then the other, the blend between those two, in the middle of those two were different postures, and they categorized that and identified it and gave the characteristics to help us identify when we're talking to someone exactly where they are in their journey toward Christ. And so as we look at this, let me encourage you, and probably you're thinking, you can tell by my presentation, I have used all three of these to lead people to Christ over the last 35 years. But I believe that the statistics are going to show that the return on our investment, that there is a track record for reaching and keeping people into the first year, that they are a part of our church family and they're regularly attending. They haven't joined yet, but we've reached them with the gospel. We've led them to Christ, and now we're going to keep them there for the first year. There is a track record that each of these have, and I want to share this with you because this one bit of information ought to help you design your ministry and lead it in a way that you'll get a better return on the investment of all the man hours, of all the people that are a part of your congregation. Don't you want to make it the return stronger, larger, better, more efficient and effective? Don't you want to be more productive and let your productivity lead to effectiveness for eternity? And so the messenger approach, when the statistics came out, I don't have any statistics that go directly with the effectiveness of the messenger approach. I believe, and I'm not certain of this, that the messenger approach is rolled into the manipulator approach as it is used. And here's what researchers have found as they tracked the reaching and keeping of people through the first year that they are reached. The manipulator approach has a success rate of 19%. To make that have more impact, that means 81% of the time, 4/5 of the time, it fails. Less than 20% of the time does a person who has been manipulated into coming to Christ through the question and answer approach, the salesman-customer approach, they don't stick and stay. They leave the church. They don't stay until you can make them fully devoted and developed followers of Christ. The retention rate is pitiful. But the meaningful approach, which is redemptive relationship approach, has a 78% success rate from the research, and the research and the numbers are down below underneath the resource section where you can go click on that, right click, and it'll open a new window in your browser, and you can read and see where the information came from as you look at our blog post. Well, it does have a 22% failure rate. So if as you look at these three approaches, and you begin to determine which one has the better return on the investment of all the man hours and the lives who have adopted the redemptive passion of Christ, and they want to reach their lost family, friends, co-workers, and social acquaintances in their community, which one of these three do you think you need to turn toward? If you're going to lead your church to adopt a different ratio of focus, where they've been strong in their upward and very intensely focused inward, and you're going to balance that by turning their eyes outward to adopt God's redemptive passion for the unchurched, for those who are lost in your community, it appears to me that we need to give a good, strong audience to the meaningful approach of redemptive relationships. So as we look at the return on your investment, the research has shown this. Churches that train members to reach out to unchurched friends and relatives see approximately 12% of those contacts come to Christ over a 5-year period. Here's another bit of research. If you train 10% of your congregation each year, you are going to see steady growth and increasing more people coming to Christ. And so if you want your church to have a stronger return on the investment of their lives as believers, to die to themselves, take up their cross, and follow Christ, then you are going to look at developing a training process to develop, teach, and train your congregation how they're going to reach out. And so churches that just get 12% are trained over a 5-year period are going to see 12% of those relationships turn into people who accept Christ and follow Christ. The key is, and the rule is, that you've got the percentage of people that you want to train every year is 10%. Now, if you can't start with 10% and the best you can do is 3%, then start with 3% or 5% or 7%. But the point is to start. So set the pathway for how you're going to train them to have redemptive relationships. So how are you going to teach and train your membership to build redemptive relationships? Because the retention rate is 4 times more effective than the salesman approach to personal evangelism. Developing redemptive relationships, the meaningful approach to personal evangelism, is 4 times more effective in reaching and keeping people so that you have time to build them into fully devoted and developed followers of Christ. It's 4 times more effective than the salesman approach, and I believe than the teacher-student approach. So how does a pastor equip his people? How are you going to equip them and educate them to develop redemptive relationships? Well, the first one, I believe, that you're going to have to use is your own personal example. You must build trust relationships with your congregation and your community. A leader must simply know the way to go, show the way, and go the way. And if you're not personally developing redemptive relationships with the unchurched in your community, I wouldn't expect your church family to do so. I've had pastors through the years say, I'm burdened for this because I stand up and I teach and preach to our people to evangelize the community, but I'm not very successful at doing it myself. And so it will help immensely if you show them by example. So you teach them from the pulpit and you train them by your personal example. It means that you're going to have to weave into your personal relationships with the unchurched part of your congregation, and you train them by their witnessing how you go about it. And so it's not one size fits all. You've got to develop your own pattern and pathway for developing redemptive relationships with the unchurched in your community and the de-church, people who once were in church and may be professing believers, but for some reason or another dropped out of church. You've got to develop your own personal pathway and pattern for leading them into a personal relationship with Christ. And so here's the first thing that I would encourage you to do is you set the example. You may start by how you develop relationships with the people in your congregation and in your community. And so if you don't value people, how can you claim to have the redemptive passion of Christ if you don't value people? If you don't understand who are they? If you don't know what makes them tick, if you don't know what's important to them, if you don't understand or you haven't asked what are their dreams, have you ever asked them what do they hope to accomplish with their lives? What are they struggling with? What do they fear? What do they like? What do they need? And on and on. That's not an exhaustive list. But how will they know if you value them? It's if you take a personal interest in them. Instead of talking about yourself and your personal testimony, you focus on them. And so set up your list of questions and begin valuing them and communicating that you value them as God values them by simply pursuing them with asking questions. Now, the second point is you set your own pattern, and these are just suggestions, is that you simply respect them. Have you ever asked them and shown that they are valuable to you by simply asking them what they think? Show them you value their opinion, that you respect their opinion. What do they think about your ministries? processes and performance and the patterns that you've got set up for how you do church in your worship services and in your other programs, projects, events, and activities. What do they think you might improve? If you're talking to your congregation or you're talking to your community, you may talk to your community about what they think about Christ, what they think about your church. And you're trying to learn and improve your connectivity intelligence, your connectivity IQ, and you must respect them. Both your people who are in the trenches of ministry, and you want to set up a pattern where you value people and you respect them and you value them for what they think and you value them for their opinion. Both the people in your congregation as you build a trust relationship with them and as you build trust relationships with people in your community. So, how does a pastor equip his people to develop redemptive relationships? So, how are you going to teach and train your congregation to develop relationships with their family, friends, co-workers, and their social acquaintances that they have, people they don't know, but that they want to get to know, and God has burdened them to do that? Well, here are 4 simple steps to help you get started. The first thing I would tell you is that you need to teach and train your people to be intentional. It simply has to be on purpose. You've got to want to build relationships with the unchurched and prepare yourself and prepare your people to handle what comes their way and your way as you do that. Here's the normal course of action. A person comes to Christ, and over time, they gravitate away from their lost family and friends and co-workers, and they gravitate into believers, those who are like them in faith, and they end up in your church and they replace the strong relationships they had when they were lost with relationships here, and eventually they end up a part of your castle, not a part of your crusade, and they are cloistered. They are like peas in a pod. They are like oysters in a shell. They are isolated and insulated and trying to survive in this world, and they naturally gravitate toward those of like mind and faith in your church. And it takes an intentional effort to come out of the church castle, out of the church club, and to go and invest themselves into the lives of the very people that they were once fully a part of. And so as you teach them, you've got to find a way to help them do this on purpose. It's got to be intentional. It's got to be on purpose. They've got to be willing to live out Matthew 16:24, where Christ tells us to count the cost of becoming a disciple, fully devoted and developed follower of Christ. To commit to Christ takes intentional commitment, decision, that you're going to die to yourself, take up your cross, and follow Christ. And it means that we follow the pattern of Christ as we see him, let's take, for example, inviting the disciples, before they were disciples, to follow him. And he developed a relationship with them over the 3-year period, and they were the ones who had grown into a fully devoted and developed follower of Christ in their journey with him that carried on the gospel into the first century. Now, you've got to teach your people that they need to be intentional. Secondly, they better be interceding for their unchurched family, friends, and co-workers and social acquaintances. You better teach them to bathe every potential relationship or every developed relationship they now have in prayer. You pray, pray, pray. I had an older preacher say to me one time, much prayer, much results. Little prayer, little results. I don't understand everything about the relationship of our prayer life with our Lord. and how that seems to affect it, but it does. And so God tells us to pray. So wherever you are in your theology, I don't think you're going to argue with me that God is very adamant and tells us repeatedly that we're to pray and watch. We are to intercede, intercession. We are to pray, pray, pray. Realize that we are partnering with God as he works in the unchurched person's heart and life, and we have the privilege of being a part of what God is doing as he brings people to himself. And we get to be a part of his redemptive passion. And the greatest cause of all time is the cause of Christ. We must be intentional, and we must intercede for them. Thirdly, is that we need to be investing. To develop redemptive relationships, we need to invest ourselves in the unchurched and the de-churched. This requires my time and my attention and my other resources to be poured into them. It's life on life. This means applying, again, Matthew 16:24. In our everyday life, we take up our cross, we die to ourselves, and we follow Christ. This investment may require you to rearrange the way you use your days, the use of your time and money, and everything that goes with living. You may have to say no to yourself, and you may have to reschedule how you use your time, how you use your talent that God has given you. You may have to rearrange how you use the treasures that God has entrusted to you, your money, your house. It means that you reevaluate how you invest your life. I don't know who first said this, but I'll say it to you, is what you're living for worth Christ dying for? Is what you're living for worth Christ dying for? How we invest our lives, and if we don't invest it for eternity, where Christ clearly tells us to lay up treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust corrupts and dissolves and eats away. Life is but a vapor, and it passes away. So what do? We teach our people, we challenge them to invest in those things that are eternal. You may find yourself introduced to different circles and be uncomfortable about it, not quite sure, and you've forgotten how you once dealt with the unchurched and the de-churched. And it takes an investment, and there's trial and error, and it requires a daily dying to self and going and living for Christ. And so the word joy, Jesus, others, and you, that acrostic, we have to live that out on a daily basis. Now, the fourth step is all along the way, as you seek to develop redemptive relationships and to show your people how to do it, both from your pulpit and your one-on-one contact with them, to train them, that you've got to show them how to invite people all along the way to follow Christ. Christ gives us an excellent example of how to do this in the Gospels. Go find the time that Christ stands and speaks to Peter and Andrew on their boat and tells them to come get him. And he cast out and told them to throw their nets over. They had fished all night. And it's early morning, and every fisherman knows as the sun comes up and it heats up that the fish go down, and it's hard to catch them with the net. During the night when it's cool, they're closer to the surface. And so I'm sure that Peter and Andrew looked at him like he was crazy. You don't know anything about fishing. We've been doing this all night and caught nothing. And Christ tells them in the heat of the morning to throw the nets over, and they about ripped their nets, pulling in all that they caught, and they had to call the other fishermen in the boats to come help them with their catch. He invited them to follow him, and the relationship began. And so as you begin to invite people to follow Christ wherever they are, whether there are you 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 in their posture and stance and attitude toward Christ, that you invite people to come and you give your people biblical instruction personal examples, and you show them by the pattern of your life how to develop redemptive relationships with lost people, people who are far from God and are in desperate need of Christ and his salvation that he provides and offers to them. And so as you look at this, you want to help them to personally go out, not just corporately through the programs and projects, events, and activities that are orchestrated, coordinated, and organized in your church, but for them as they live out their faith in their home and with their neighbor next door and with their coworker and with their family in town and their acquaintances that they are making day to day. You want to give them a pattern and a pathway that they can follow. I'm giving you some simple steps that can help you get started with this. So here are some important connectivity metrics, and I'm still wanting to convince you and help you to convince your congregation to begin developing both corporately and individually redemptive relationships with the unchurched and the dechurched in your community. So how many relationships do your individual church members need to have to grow your church? How many would you say? As you think about this, and what I mean by this is, John Brown in your church, how many personal relationships, redemptive relationships does he need with the unchurched in your community in order to grow your church, to reach more people, where your church grows in number and people are coming to Christ? How many? Well, the research has shown 9 or more. 9 or more redemptive relationships John Brown needs to have, or John Doe, in your church in order for your church to grow, for you to go from 50 people to 100 to 150 to 200, and from a small church, 200 and under, to a medium-sized church, 200 to 400, or to a large church, 400 to 1,200, or to a mega church, wherever you want to set the number there, 1,200, some say 2,000. If you want it to consistently grow from level to level because you have adopted God's redemptive passion, then they need to have 9 or more personal relationships to grow. If they have 6 or so, your church is going to plateau. If they have 3 or less, it leads to decline. So as you look at this and you begin to investigate and to interview your church leadership, let's just start there, maybe your paid staff and your church leadership, your lay leaders, and then your ministry directors of your different ministries in your church, and you begin to ask them this, you're going to find out maybe a simple metric such as this as to why your church just seems to be stalled out, or worse, you're shrinking and sinking. So if you're stalled out, you're plateaued, or you're in decline, here's a metric that you can work toward. So how many relationships do new people in your church need to develop if they're going to stay at your church long term? So let's just say, and the research deals with looks at their staying there for 1 year. How many relationships do the new people who have come and started regularly attending your church need to develop in your church in order to stay at your church for at least the first year? Well, here are the numbers. Here's the metrics. 7 friends in 6 months means they'll stick and stay. 3 to 5 new friends in your church. So a new person comes into your church. If they make 3 to 5 solid relationships in the first 6 months, they'll possibly stick it out and stay through the first year. If they have 2 or less in 6 months, they will probably separate from you and just move away. I wrote a blog, and I'll try to remember to put it in the resources, that research was done to give you a game plan of what do you do when you notice that someone is gone 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 5 weeks, 6 weeks, and what is the percentage of time that when they disappear like that and they're gone for a couple of weeks and they're back for 3 weeks and then they're gone for 2 more weeks and they're back for 2 weeks and then they're gone for 6 weeks and they're back for a week, how do you head this off to keep them from it's attrition. It's going out the back door of the church. And so when you start looking at the metrics, there are definite things that you can focus on and begin designing a game plan to help you reach them and keep them. And that's what this video and the connectivity intelligence video corporately is helping you set up and understand the metrics and then design a way to help your people more effectively and efficiently reach and keep people in your community so that you can grow them into fully devoted and developed followers of Christ. So as we look at these, what are you learning? What do you need to do here in order to have long-term success in your church? Well, I believe that we have seen that redemptive relationships and developing those and then helping your people as they reach the unchurched and bring them into their church, that your church family needs to gravitate to these new people and to invest themselves in it so that you develop a multitude of redemptive relationships with this unchurched person who is on a journey of coming to Christ and has started attending your services, or they're a new believer and they just come to Christ and you want them to stick and stay instead of separate. Then you have to help your people then to focus in on them and to develop relationships with them, and you need to design ways for that to happen. It can be done through Sunday school, through small groups, through some program or project or event or activities that you design that works best in your context. So, how are you going to connect with your community, corporately and personally? And these two videos are designed to help you decide that. Well, I'm Marshall Shannon, a ministry design coach with Ministry Design Training and Ministry Design Concepts. You can reach us at the office at this number or on my cell phone at this number, and I trust the Lord's blessing on you as you try to apply some of these things that we've dealt with in this webinar.